Good morning, it's lovely to be with you today. Our reading is taken from Romans chapter 12, beginning at verses 1 to 6. Place your life before God. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognise what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. I am speaking to you out of deep gratitude for all that God has given me, and especially as I have responsibilities in relation to you. Living then as every one of you does in pure grace. It's important that you not misinterpret yourselves as people who are bringing this goodness to God. No, God brings it all to you. The only accurate way to understand ourselves is by what God is and by what He does for us, not by what we are and what we do for Him. In this way, we are like the various parts of a human body. Each part gets its meaning from the body as a whole, not the other way round. The body we're talking about is Christ's body of chosen people. Each of us finds our meaning and function as part of His body. But as a chopped off finger or a cut off toe, we wouldn't amount to much, would we? So, since we find ourselves fashioned into all these excellently well-formed and marvellously functioning parts in Christ's body, let's just go ahead and be what we were made to be, without enviously or pridefully comparing ourselves with each other, or trying to be something we aren't. That was taken from the Message version of the Bible. I'm going to be speaking today about serving. Research and statistics can be an invaluable tool on so many levels. However, as you know, they can be also both alarming and useful at the same time. Research tells us that for an average person living to the age of 80, they will spend approximately 26 years of their life sleeping, 7 years trying to get to sleep, 13 years at work, 4.5 years eating, 3 years going on holiday, 1 year exercising, 1 year engaging in being romantic, whatever that may look like. And you probably won't be surprised to learn that 11 years of the average person's life is spent watching TV and online video content. Those types of statistics are always rather sobering, aren't they? But as Christians, I wonder how much of our time we can say is spent serving others. Strangely, I could not find, or at least readily, any statistics to suggest how much of the average person's life is spent serving others. Let's take a moment to reflect on our own lives, and I wonder what comes to mind when we think about what it means to serve. Maybe it's voluntary roles in the local community, charity work, those who help within church or running a local cub or scout pack. Maybe you have very young children or are caring for an elderly loved one, and and every day feels like sacrificial acts of service. We're going to be exploring today what it means to serve, but also through how being servant-hearted leads to transformation in us as Christians. A quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love." So firstly, what does a Christian who is serving others look like? Serving is considered to be one of the spiritual disciplines or practices in the Bible that promote spiritual growth. Other spiritual disciplines include fasting, confession, and prayer. The verb for discipline is to train. And in the book of Timothy, we see that Paul is coaching him to train himself for godliness, as it holds promise for not only the present life, but the life to come. So when we're talking about spiritual disciplines, such as serving, these are very much deliberate and intentional actions that are integral to us learning how to be disciples of Jesus and ultimately to become more like him, which is our end game as Christians. They help us to bear fruit now and in the present, but also for the life that we have to look forward to. Paul outlines this in the start of today's passage. "Here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, sleeping, eating, going to work, walking around life, and place it before God as an offering." The NIV version puts it another way, urging us to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice. So to think back to those earlier statistics we spoke of at the beginning, serving should account for 100% of our lives. Note the words everyday and ordinary. Simple words. Paul is talking about the actions and the interactions that each of us have in our daily lives that are very often overlooked. For example, how we serve those that we work with, that we live with. I remember when our own children were very small and both at home full time, and listening to a sermon about how this season of raising children is God-given opportunities to serve sacrificially. Changing nappies, feeding, helping to get to sleep, but to name a few. Well, I know that I certainly met those needs of my children, but I'm not sure how joyful I was in doing so on many occasions. There was certainly a lot of grumbling and whinging. And yet when I reflect back on those experiences, it is through those acts of service that we grow in humility and we grow in our Christ-likeness. And certainly those early weeks with a new baby, although were purely sacrificial, the intimacy that we had with our newborn and those moments were incredibly precious despite the sacrificial cost of waking up numerous times in the night and having very little time to ourselves. Stephen Cherry, a well-known Anglican priest, suggests that one way to understand this discipleship learning is that we are Jesus's apprentices. Apprentices learn, don't they, by spending time with a master to absorb their message and their methods and their wisdom. Take any profession or job, a dentist, a musician, an electrician. There is certainly knowledge and skills to learn in order for you to be qualified to do that role and effective in that role. You spend time working alongside and observing someone who has gone before you and is very much a master in their field. For us, Jesus is the ultimate master in serving and led by example. Now here, and I think it is important to note that one significant difference between learning a new skill or profession and making a decision to accept Jesus into our lives is that we are offered these gifts of forgiveness, of unconditional love. We do not earn them. We don't work to receive them. God's love for us is not dependent on whether we train or we take part in these spiritual disciplines such as serving. And when we begin the journey to become more like Jesus, it is less about learning new skills, but more about becoming a new person. Jesus is more interested in us being transformed rather than informed. And in today's passage, Paul makes this point when he writes to the Christians in Rome. He reminds them that they're living in pure grace. And it's important that they don't misinterpret themselves as people who are bringing this goodness to God. So it is not through what we do for him. Often as Christians we can fall into the trap, can't we, of trying to earn ourselves a better relationship with God and an acceptance by him through what we do. So if God's love is not dependent on whether we serve those around us, why does the Bible encourage us to do so? Well, Paul reminds us that we fully need to grasp what God has done for us. And this deep gratitude in us is what leads to change in our hearts, which then leads to change in our actions. We read in Galatians 5 verse 13 that we are called to be free. But we're not to then use that freedom to just indulge ourselves, but rather serving others. I chose to entitle this talk Bless Because You Are Blessed. And through recognising God's blessing on us, I believe that then stirs us to want to bless others. When I was preparing for this talk, I actually went to a dictionary just to have a look at what the word serve actually means. And definitions include to be of use and to provide something that is needed. So to be clear, we're not talking about character traits here, but on actions, practical actions. However, discipleship's not just another example of a self-help program. If you begin doing A, B and C, it leads to this outcome. Rather, it's a much more radical level through practicing these acts of service on a daily basis. In time, then become very much deep and semi-automatic habits, which then causes our hearts and our minds to be changed. I expect I'm not the only parent here who is faithfully hoping that through prompting and modelling to their children to say please and thank you for years and years, that eventually this habit is then going to be said from a place of gratitude, not just because they've been told to. In the remaining parts of the passage which we've looked at today, Paul goes on to use the image of the body with its various limbs and organs to illustrate that us, the church, is a unity and it's made up of very different members, but we all share the same faith. As Christ's body, we will have different gifts to offer. And as a church family here at St John's, we want to recognise and value those gifts and would really encourage you to use those to bless the church family and those around you. Today's passage speaks of gifts of providing encouragement to others, hospitality, teaching, leading, and this list is not exhaustive. There are many, many more. Paul is encouraging his readers to get ready for serving, and in doing so, he highlights that being prepared to serve others will involve sacrifice on our part, whether that be time, our finances, our energy. Something that really struck me when I read this passage was that following each example of how Paul outlines that we may use our gifts, he offers advice on what to do when it becomes tough, and clearly expects us to find it difficult. Because for every do, he follows this with a don't. So verses 6 to 8, for example, read, help, but don't take over. Encourage, but be careful that you don't become bossy. It would appear that being servant-hearted does not come naturally. I can certainly relate to that. Waking up to a newborn and trying to not complain about the tiredness and the exhaustion wasn't easy. But I think this is a very real picture of what happens when we as Christians begin serving. We don't necessarily do so well, and when God is at the centre, changing our hearts, it will become so much more natural, and those deep automatic habits become ingrained. We're not really surprised then when Paul reminds us in the very first line of this passage that we can only do what we've been asked to do with God's Spirit helping us. He doesn't leave us to serve in our own strength. And Paul makes it quite clear that the Holy Spirit is there to equip us, and this will lead to growing in godliness. But it's going to be a long, slow walk, and we're going to need God's Spirit every day as we seek to change. I expect I'm not the only one that has woken up one day, possibly on New Year's Day, and decided that I've got a new fitness regime or a new quiet time regime. And very quickly, within a few weeks, it's fallen to the wayside or not so frequent as I had originally planned. So how do I and us as a church respond to this invitation to serve? We have a striking example of Jesus who models the humility and posture of a servant. And we see this when he is washing his disciples' feet. Probably a very familiar story to all of us here. But not only do we see in this example that Jesus is telling his followers what to do to be more like him, we actually see him showing them. I wonder how you feel when you read this familiar story. Jesus wanted to communicate to his disciples that they needed a new set of attitudes. Humility is, I would suggest, not a popular value that our culture aspires to today. We seem to live in a culture of individualism, and any example of service to others, we want everyone to know about it. As a teacher, my colleagues and I often smile at the children who, whenever they have carried out a job or a task in class, expect a sticker or a team point as a reward. A childish example this may be, but is this any different from us wanting to publicise our acts of kindness on Twitter or on our Instagram page? Paul makes the point again in our reading that we're not to become so well adjusted to our culture that we fit into it without even thinking. We're called to be different, and serving others is countercultural, a countercultural way of thinking and doing. Mike Pilavachi, a well-known evangelist, suggests that by immersing ourselves in serving others, it's this that takes our eyes off ourselves. Stephen Cherry puts it another way and suggests that God calls us to a path of other awareness and self-forgetfulness. Yet we're not called to be self-hating or self-loving. Paul knew he was important and valuable in God's eyes, and that God's is the only opinion ultimately that counts, not his own and not those around him. And it was from this place of security, of blessing and unconditional love that he was then able to bless those around him. About 7 years ago now, my husband and I had a really tough time, which, as often is the way with these things, happened very unexpectedly. My father had been given a very sudden terminal diagnosis and died only a short number of weeks afterwards. A couple of weeks after hearing that news, Drew suffered a serious head injury, which resulted in him being incapacitated for a number of months in and out of hospital receiving treatment. My initial response, which you may relate to, was to become fiercely independent and determined that I could cope not only caring for my dad, for Drew and my 2 young children. However, our Christian friends overwhelmed us with so many acts of service. To say that we were blessed feels like a huge understatement. For 6 months, our friends organised a food rota, and I remember standing on the doorstep every day, and they'd just ring the doorbell so as to not disturb us, and would leave a wonderful meal, a dessert, bottles of drink, little activity packs for the children, every single evening for 6 months or more. And those friends that were not able to do that, who lived too far away, would send food deliveries and filled our freezer to the point where there was so much food I didn't actually know what to do with it, and was able to give the extra food away and ironically bless others through being blessed. We had friends offering to financially support us if Drew had been unable to return to work. Friends that would just collect Rupert, who was 3 at the time, and pick Esme up from school. And the list goes on. I could list so many more examples of how our Christian friends, and I have to say it was predominantly Christian friends who faithfully supported us day in, day out. And I know how much that would have cost them in terms of their time, their money and their energy, and the impact on their own families. But yet during those 6 months and beyond, Drew and I experienced an enormous blessing of being served by others, and an enormous blessing lesson on thankfulness. I realised that this is just one example of serving others that we were privileged to be on the receiving end for. And there are many other opportunities to serve in people's lives. And today we've been particularly thinking about how we can serve here at church and within our church community. And I would really encourage you to spend some time reflecting on how you serve personally, where God is calling you to serve, and where you could be able to offer the gifts that we all have to really bless those around us. And if there is anybody that you would like to speak to at the end of the service, about where you might be able to serve, we would love to hear from you. My prayer is that we can begin to form daily habits in our lives where we can ask God on a daily basis who we can serve and where we can serve, and be excited about how this brings transformation in each of our lives.